It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new house, a new chapter. For Alex, moving into a house on the outskirts of town was meant to be the escape they needed. A break from the chaos of city life, a place where they could finally have peace and focus on what mattered. Little did they know that this quiet retreat would soon become a place of nightmares. The house stood at the edge of a quiet, secluded neighborhood. The once pristine white walls were now faded, with ivy creeping up the sides, giving it an air of mystery. The yard was spacious, with trees that swayed eerily in the wind, and the distant sound of crickets at night added to the solitude. It felt like the perfect place for Alex to unwind. When Alex first stepped inside, the house seemed welcoming. The floors creaked underfoot, and the walls had a certain charm to them, even if they were old and worn. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air, reminding Alex that they were, indeed, in a place that had a history. Alex spent the first few days unpacking and getting to know the house. The rooms were spacious, the kitchen was cozy, and there was a large basement at the far end of the hallway. The basement door was made of heavy wood, with an old-fashioned brass handle that squeaked when touched. It seemed out of place compared to the rest of the house, but Alex thought nothing of it. It was just another part of the house, after all. But there was something unsettling about the basement. It wasn't the door or the room itself. It was the feeling that seemed to linger around it, a sensation that Alex couldn't shake. Every time they passed by the door, there was a strange chill in the air, like a cold breath whispering from within. At first, Alex dismissed it as their imagination, the result of moving into an old house in a new town. But as the days passed, the feeling only grew stronger. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Alex decided to explore the basement. They had been curious about it since the moment they moved in, and tonight, they finally decided to face whatever unease it stirred within them. Grabbing a flashlight from a drawer, they made their way to the door. The cold air seemed to intensify as they reached for the handle, the brass still warm to the touch, despite the chill in the air. As the door creaked open, Alex's heart raced. The basement was dimly lit, with only a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The shadows danced along the walls, stretching and shifting like living things. The stairs led down into darkness, the wooden steps groaning under Alex's weight as they descended. The basement was a strange place. Boxes were stacked against the walls, some covered in dust, others with faded labels that suggested they hadn't been touched in years. There was an old furnace in one corner, its metal pipes winding across the floor like veins, and a few old chairs and a small wooden table cluttered in another corner. But it wasn't the old furniture or the dust that made Alex pause. It was the sensation that something or someone was watching them. Alex froze, the hairs on the back of their neck standing up as they felt a cold, unseen presence in the room. The flashlight flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows against the walls. Then, in the corner of the room, something caught Alex's eye. A figure, tall, dark, and formless, seemed to emerge from the shadows. It was only for a split second, but Alex saw it. A shadow standing at the farthest corner of the basement, just beyond the light's reach. It seemed to move slowly, as if it had been waiting there for Alex to finally notice it. The flashlight flickered again, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. Alex's heart pounded in their chest. They stepped backward, the cold air now pressing in around them. Was it just their mind playing tricks? Had the darkness and the dim light created an illusion? Alex didn't know, but the feeling in the pit of their stomach told them that something was wrong. Something was here, something that didn't want them to stay. They quickly turned and ascended the stairs, slamming the door behind them. The cold air that had filled the basement followed them, lingering in the hallway. The house, once welcoming, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence around them was deafening. For the rest of the night, Alex tried to push the experience out of their mind. They tried to tell themselves it was just the unfamiliarity of the house, the weird lighting, the silence. But deep down, they knew something had been there, something they couldn't explain. The next few nights passed uneventfully, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time they walked past the basement door, they felt it, a prickling on the back of their neck, as if something was waiting for them to open it again. They tried to ignore it, but the unease grew with each passing day. And then one night, as Alex lay in bed, they heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something brushing against the floor. It was faint, but clear enough to make Alex's heart race. They lay still, eyes wide open in the darkness, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time, as if something or someone was moving in the hallway. Alex held their breath, waiting, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence once again enveloped the house, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Alex didn't know what to do. The house was supposed to be their sanctuary, but now it felt like a prison, a place where something lived, something that didn't belong, something that had been waiting for them. As the days passed, the strange occurrences intensified. The lights in the house began to flicker, especially in the rooms closest to the basement. The shadows seemed darker, longer, and more oppressive. And at night, Alex could swear they saw something, just out of the corner of their eye, a figure moving through the house, disappearing before they could focus on it. Alex realized something. The shadow in the basement wasn't just a trick of the mind. It was real, and it was watching them. The next day, Alex tried to shake off the feeling that had settled in their chest. The strange noises, the cold air that always seemed to creep from the basement, and the shadow that seemed to move of its own accord. They tried to focus on their work, to distract themselves from the growing dread that lingered in every corner of the house. But no matter how hard they tried, the feeling never quite left. It clung to them like a second skin, always there, watching, waiting. The basement door was no longer just a door. It had become a symbol of something more sinister. Every time Alex walked past it, they felt the hairs on the back of their neck stand up. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cage. That evening, after dinner, Alex found themselves staring at the basement door again. The house was eerily quiet, and the shadows cast by the fading light seemed darker than usual. The longer Alex stared at the door, the more they felt an overwhelming urge to open it again. They knew they shouldn't. They knew something was wrong, that the basement wasn't a place they should be going. But the curiosity was too strong, the need to know what was lurking behind that door. With a deep breath, Alex walked towards the basement door. The cold air, which seemed to always follow them, was even more intense tonight. It felt like a physical presence, pressing down on them as they reached for the brass handle. The door groaned as it opened, as if protesting, but Alex pushed it wide, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The basement was the same as before, yet somehow different. The shadows felt deeper, darker. They moved in ways that didn't make sense, as if they were alive. The air was thick with something unspoken, something Alex couldn't name, but it was there. Something pressing down on their chest, making it harder to breathe. With the flashlight in hand, Alex descended the stairs once again. The familiar creak of the steps underfoot echoed in the otherwise silent room. But tonight, it wasn't the steps that caused Alex to pause. It was the unmistakable sound of something moving in the dark. The air was still, but the shadows, they were shifting, twisting, as if something was moving just out of sight. Alex's heart raced in their chest as they swung the flashlight around, desperate to see what was in the dark. The beam of light cut through the basement, landing on the old furniture, the boxes, and the old furnace in the corner. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the cold. The temperature had dropped again, and Alex could see their breath as it puffed out in small clouds in front of them. It wasn't just cold. It was like the very air had turned hostile, thick with something unexplainable. The beam of the flashlight trembled in Alex's hand as they walked deeper into the basement. They stopped when the light caught something in the farthest corner, just where the walls met the floor. At first, Alex thought it was just an old coat or something thrown carelessly into the corner. But then they saw it. A shadow, tall and dark, standing perfectly still. It was the same shape they had seen before, the same unsettling form that seemed to emerge from the darkness. Alex's breath caught in their throat. The shadow didn't move. It didn't react to the light. It just stood there, as if it had always been there, waiting. The air felt thicker now, pressing in from all sides, suffocating. "Hello!" Alex's voice barely broke through the silence. There was no answer. Of course, there wasn't. They took a step forward, their pulse hammering in their ears. The flashlight flickered for a moment, casting the basement into an even deeper darkness before it steadied again. But when it did, the shadow was gone, vanished. Alex's stomach churned, their body frozen in place. They turned slowly, scanning the entire room with the flashlight, desperate to find something, anything that could explain what they had seen. But there was nothing. Nothing except the cold, the silence, and the growing sense of dread. Then they heard it, a soft scrape, a whisper of movement, like something dragging across the floor. The sound was coming from behind them, from the corner where the shadow had stood. Alex spun around, but there was nothing there. The basement was empty, just as it had been before. The scraping sound stopped, but Alex knew. Deep down, they knew something was there. Something was in the basement with them, something that was moving, watching, waiting. A chill ran down Alex's spine as they turned and climbed the stairs back up to the safety of the main floor. The door slammed shut behind them, and they leaned against it, breathing heavily. Their heart was pounding in their chest, and they could feel the sweat on their skin despite the cold that clung to the house. The next few days were a blur of unease. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, watched. Every time they walked through the house, every time they walked past the basement door, they could feel it, the presence lurking just beyond their vision. It was as though something was always just out of reach, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The noises became more frequent. At night, Alex would hear faint whispers, soft footsteps in the hallway, or the scraping sound that seemed to come from the basement. The house was alive with sounds that didn't belong. But when Alex tried to investigate, they found nothing. The house was empty, the silence broken only by their own racing heart. But it wasn't the noises that frightened Alex the most. It was the shadow, the figure that seemed to lurk in the corners of their vision, always there but never fully seen. It was growing bolder now, creeping closer and closer, until Alex could feel its presence in every room, every hallway, every corner. It was waiting for something, and Alex had a sinking feeling that whatever it was coming for them. One night, after a long day of work, Alex sat in their living room, trying to relax. The house was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the fridge in the kitchen. But as Alex sat there, a cold breeze swept through the room. The hair on the back of their neck stood on end, and the air became thick, heavy. Alex turned slowly, their eyes falling on the basement door. For a moment, they just stared at it, hypnotized by the way the shadows gathered around it. It was as though the door was pulling them in, drawing them toward the darkness beyond. Without thinking, Alex stood up and walked toward it. Every step felt heavier than the last, and by the time they reached the door, their heart was in their throat. They reached for the handle, and with a deep breath, they opened it. Alex stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the darkness below. The basement felt different tonight. It wasn't just the cold or the unsettling silence. It was the way the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Something was down there, and it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. Taking a deep breath, Alex stepped forward, their heart pounding in their chest. The flashlight in their hand seemed to flicker, as if hesitant to provide the comfort of light. They paused, gripping it tightly, before finally descending into the basement. The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they moved lower, the sound echoing in the otherwise still house. Alex's breath came in shallow gasps, and each step felt like an eternity. The basement door at the top of the stairs slammed shut behind them with a low, groaning sound that sent a chill through their body. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the same old furniture and the piles of boxes they had grown so familiar with. But tonight, the shadows seemed to move in ways that didn't make sense. It was as though the light wasn't strong enough to push them back completely. They swirled and twisted, constantly shifting just beyond the reach of the beam. Alex shivered, and for a moment, they considered going back upstairs. But something, a deep, primal curiosity, urged them to stay. They had to know what was in the basement, what was causing the strange things they had been feeling. As they stepped further into the room, the temperature dropped even more. The cold was unbearable now, wrapping around Alex like an invisible hand. They could see their breath in front of them, the small puffs of vapor disappearing into the still air. And then they saw it, the shadow. It wasn't like any shadow Alex had seen before. It was tall, distorted, and seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the ceiling. The edges of the shadow flickered, moving as if alive. The longer Alex looked at it, the more it seemed to change shape. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something that didn't belong. Alex froze. The flashlight in their hand trembled, the beam of light flickering erratically. For a moment, they thought it was their imagination playing tricks on them. But the shadow remained, standing still, waiting. They tried to speak, but their voice caught in their throat. The words didn't come. Alex's mind raced as they struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Was it a trick of the light? A shadow cast by something in the room? No, it was something else. Something worse. Before Alex could react, the shadow moved. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. The shadow seemed to slither across the floor, its shape shifting as it moved. Alex felt the blood drain from their face as the shadow grew, stretching further, its presence growing larger in the room. It was coming closer, and the air around them thickened, making it hard to breathe. Alex stumbled backward, their mind racing. "No, this isn't real," they whispered. But the words felt hollow, as if they were trying to convince themselves. The shadow didn't care about their disbelief. It was moving, getting closer. The flashlight flickered again, and when the light returned, the shadow was almost right in front of them. It was no longer just a shape in the corner. It had taken on form. A tall figure, its outline jagged and indistinct, with no discernible features. It was like looking at a dark, empty void. Alex's heart pounded in their chest as they turned and ran. Their feet pounded against the cold floor of the basement as they made their way to the stairs. But just as they reached the bottom step, they heard a soft scraping noise behind them. Something moving, something dragging itself across the floor. Alex didn't dare look back. They scrambled up the stairs, their hands slipping against the railing, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The basement door slammed shut behind them, and Alex stumbled backward, their heart racing, their pulse thundering in their ears. They stood there, frozen, trying to catch their breath. The house was silent again, the only sound the frantic beating of Alex's heart. They glanced toward the basement door, half expecting to see the shadow standing on the other side, watching them. But there was nothing. For a long time, Alex stood there, staring at the door. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something waiting, lurking just out of sight. The silence felt suffocating, oppressive, pressed in on Alex from all sides, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Alex turned away from the door and walked slowly down the hallway, trying to convince themselves that it was just a trick of the mind, that the shadow wasn't real. But deep down, they knew it was. They had felt it, the cold, the darkness, the unmistakable presence of something that wasn't human. They stopped in the living room, sinking into a chair as their hands trembled. Their mind was racing, but it couldn't focus. All they could think about was the shadow, that thing in the basement. The way it moved, the way it seemed to live and breathe. They couldn't ignore it any longer. Alex had to find out what was going on. They had to go back down to the basement, even if it terrified them. The next night, Alex made their decision. They would confront the shadow. They would find out what it wanted, what it was, and why it was haunting them. But deep down, Alex feared that going back into the basement would be a mistake. That whatever was down there, whatever had been following them, wasn't something they could escape. They tried to push those thoughts away, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of their mind. The shadow wasn't done with them, and whatever happened next, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that it would be far worse than anything they could imagine. The air was thick with tension as Alex stood at the top of the basement stairs. Their hand trembled as it gripped the banister, and every part of their body screamed to turn around and leave. But something pushed them forward, an unstoppable need to confront whatever was lurking down there. They could hear nothing. The house was silent. The usual creaks and groans of old would absent in the stillness. Alex took a deep breath, the chill of the night air biting at their skin. The darkness below seemed endless, and they could almost feel it calling to them, pulling them closer. With a shaky sigh, Alex took the first step down. The cold hit them immediately, creeping up their legs and into their bones. Each step felt heavier, each breath more difficult to take. It felt like they were walking into the very heart of darkness, and with each step, the weight on their chest grew. The flashlight flickered to life in their hand, casting weak beams of light that did little to push back the shadows. The basement seemed to grow larger as Alex descended, the shadows stretching and shifting, playing tricks on their eyes. They couldn't stop looking over their shoulder, half expecting the door to slam shut behind them at any moment. Every inch of the space felt alive, watching, waiting. They didn't know if it was the shadows themselves or the fear creeping up on them. Alex reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated, standing still in the cold, air thick with the smell of dust and decay. The basement stretched out before them, lined with forgotten boxes, old furniture, and rusting tools. But it wasn't the items that made their skin crawl. It was the shadows, the movement in the corner of their vision, the feeling of being watched. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and they froze. That wasn't normal. There was no wind, no reason for the house to groan like that. Alex's breath quickened, and they shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing. And then it happened. The flashlight beam landed on a shape in the corner of the room. First, Alex thought it was just a trick of the light, but then the shadow moved. It shifted and twitched, like it was alive. Alex's heart pounded in their chest as the shadow began to grow, creeping along the floor like it was reaching out toward them. The air grew colder, and Alex could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. They tried to speak, but their voice caught in their throat. They couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow stretched, almost as if it was alive, slithering across the floor toward them. It was then that Alex realized the shadow wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a trick of the light. There was something else in the room with them, something that had been waiting, watching. The shape grew larger, its form twisting and shifting, becoming something more than just a shadow. It was a figure now, standing tall in the corner of the basement. The outline was unclear, a black mass that blocked out the light. But Alex could feel it, feel the presence in the room with them. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, Alex saw it. The shadow's face, or what could be considered a face, was distorted, with no eyes, no features, just a dark void where there should have been something human. It was staring at them. Alex's heart raced. Fear clawed at their chest, and they couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller, closing in on them. The cold was unbearable now, a sharp, biting chill that made it impossible to think clearly. The shadow didn't move, but Alex felt its presence. It wasn't a passive thing. It wasn't waiting for them to make the first move. It was waiting for them to make the wrong one. Without thinking, Alex turned and ran. They stumbled over their feet, their body moving instinctively, driven by terror. Their mind was racing, trying to make sense of what they had seen, but there was no sense to be made. The shadow was real, and it was coming for them. The footsteps echoed in the empty basement as Alex raced up the stairs. Their pulse was deafening in their ears, and they could feel the presence behind them, getting closer. But when they looked back, there was nothing, only darkness. With one final burst of energy, Alex reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut behind them. They gasped for air, their chest heaving as they backed away from the door. The house felt quieter now, but the silence was worse than ever. Alex stood there, their hands shaking, trying to calm their breathing. The basement door was locked now, and they couldn't hear any movement from the other side. But that didn't mean it was over. They had seen it. They had felt it. The shadow was real, and it was still down there, waiting for them. The night was long, and Alex couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Their body felt exhausted, but their mind refused to rest. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw that void where the face should have been, the black emptiness that seemed to stare right through them. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound of wind, no creaks of the old wood. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Alex had locked the basement door, but it didn't feel like enough. It never felt like enough. The shadow was still there, somewhere, and every time they thought about it, their stomach turned. After a long while, Alex pulled themselves off the couch and made their way to the kitchen. They needed something to calm their nerves, maybe a cup of tea. They hoped the warm drink would settle the unease that clung to them like a second skin. The kitchen was as cold as the rest of the house. Alex flicked on the light and grabbed a mug from the cabinet. Their hands still shook slightly as they filled the kettle with water. Every noise felt louder in the silence of the house, the faint buzz of the fridge, the ticking of the clock, but none of them were as unsettling as the silence that came after. As the water began to heat up, Alex's mind wandered back to the basement. The shadow wasn't just a figment of their imagination. It was something more, something that had been in that house long before Alex ever moved in. The kettle clicked, and Alex poured the hot water over the tea bag, watching it swirl in the cup. They needed to find answers. They couldn't just pretend the shadow wasn't real. But how could they explain what they'd seen? Who would believe them? They turned and glanced out of the kitchen window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the yard. The trees were still, their branches barely moving in the windless night. But as Alex's eyes moved across the yard, they froze. A shadow moved. It was just a flicker, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up their spine. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. Alex dropped the mug, spilling hot tea across the counter. They didn't care. They couldn't tear their eyes away from the window. The shadow outside hadn't moved, but it felt wrong, like it was watching them too. The kitchen was suddenly stifling. Alex backed away from the window, heart racing, but as they turned, they caught movement in the corner of their eye. It was the shadow again. Not in the yard, not in the window, but inside the house. It was in the hallway now, near the stairs. Alex's breath caught in their throat. The air grew thick, like it was pressing down on them. They couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The shadow was getting closer. Their minds screamed at them to run, but their feet wouldn't move. They stood frozen, the weight of the shadow's presence pushing them back. It wasn't just lurking anymore. It was coming for them. Alex's legs finally found the strength to move, and they bolted from the kitchen. They didn't know where they were going. They just needed to get away. The front door was locked, and the only other way out was through the basement. But Alex wasn't going back down there. Not now. Not with the shadow so close. They turned into the living room and grabbed the first thing they could find. A lamp. They held it out in front of them like a weapon, the soft light trembling in their shaking hand. It didn't make the house feel any safer, but at least it was something. The air felt colder now, the room darker despite the light in their hand. The house seemed to close in on them, the walls shifting, the floors groaning like it was alive, feeding off their fear. Alex stood there, trying to steady their breath, staring into the shadows. They didn't want to look, didn't want to see the thing that had been following them. But they couldn't stop themselves. Slowly, they turned their head. The shadow was there, standing at the edge of the hallway. It was watching them. Alex's heart pounded in their chest, each beat louder than the last. The shadow didn't move, didn't speak. It was just there, stretching and writhing in the corner of the room. Alex's mind raced. It had to be real. Couldn't be anything else. They weren't imagining it. But what did it want? Before they could process any more thoughts, the shadow took a step forward. A slow, deliberate step that sent a wave of cold through the room. The darkness seemed to ripple around it, like the air itself was thickening. And then, Alex heard something. A whisper. A soft, almost inaudible whisper. It wasn't coming from the shadow. It was coming from the house itself. The whisper grew louder, and the words became clearer. "Help me." Alex's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, distant, but it was unmistakable, and it was coming from inside the house. The whisper wasn't from the shadow. It wasn't from anything Alex could see. It was coming from the walls, the floors, the air itself. "Help me." The whisper echoed again, louder this time, more desperate. Alex's heart slammed against their ribcage. They felt the weight of it, the pull to go towards it, to find the source of the voice. But they couldn't move. The fear held them in place. The whisper came again, this time, not a request, but a command. "Come closer." The darkness around them seemed to shift, stretching out as if it was alive. The shadows in the corners of the room began to pulse, closing in on them from every angle. Alex could feel the walls pressing in, suffocating them. But the voice, the whisper, it wasn't from the shadow. It wasn't from the house. It was something else. Something that had been waiting, watching, and it wasn't done with Alex yet. Alex couldn't breathe. The whisper in the air, so clear, so demanding, sent cold shivers down their spine. "Come closer." The voice wasn't friendly. It was a command, a summons drawing them into the darkness. Their legs trembled, and their heart raced. But they couldn't move. Something was holding them in place, a weight pressing down on their chest. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in, the shadows stretching like they had a life of their own. Alex glanced around. The living room was bathed in a faint glow from the lamp in their hand. But the shadows were growing darker, deeper. The edges of the room seemed to fade away into blackness, and that whisper, it kept calling. "Come closer." Alex swallowed hard. The house had always felt off, but now it was different. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. Something was happening, and it wasn't going to stop until they figured it out. Slowly, against every instinct screaming to run, Alex took a small step forward. The shadows shifted, reacting to their movement, almost like they were alive. The pulse of darkness around them grew stronger, and the whisper followed. Closer. The coldness deepened. The air felt thick, suffocating. Alex's feet moved without thinking, drawn toward the basement door. The one place they had avoided for days. The one place they knew held the answers. They reached for the doorknob with trembling hands. The metal felt cold under their fingers, colder than it should have been. With a deep breath, Alex turned the knob. The door creaked open. The basement was dark, deeper than any shadow. There was no light, just an impenetrable blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly. The smell of old dust and mildew mixed with something else, something foul, like rot. Alex hesitated, their pulse quickening. Every fiber of their being screamed at them to turn back, but the whisper still echoed in their mind. It was pulling them deeper into the house, deeper into the darkness. They stepped inside. The air in the basement was even colder than before. It wrapped around Alex like icy fingers, squeezing the breath out of their lungs. The darkness felt alive, watching, waiting. Then something moved. Alex froze. There was no sound, no footstep, just the unmistakable feeling that something was there, just out of sight. Their breath caught in their throat, and their heart hammered in their chest. They couldn't see anything, but they could feel it. Something was watching them. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't a command. It was a plea. "Help me. Please help." The voice was closer now, desperate, filled with pain. Alex took another shaky step forward, their body moving against their will, driven by an instinct they didn't understand. The whisper was too strong to ignore, too powerful. It seemed to pull them deeper into the basement, further into the blackness. As they moved, the shadows around them seemed to grow thicker, denser, like they were closing in. The temperature dropped even more, and Alex could see their breath in the air. They felt the cold, the presence. Something was right there, just beyond the veil of darkness. Suddenly, there was a sound, a scraping noise like something dragging across the floor. Alex's blood ran cold. The sound was coming from the far corner of the basement, the darkest part of the room. Their hand tightened on the lamp, and they took another step, this time more cautiously. The scraping noise grew louder, like nails on a chalkboard. Then it stopped. There was an eerie silence. Alex's breath quickened, and they strained their ears, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But the silence stretched on. It was almost worse than the noise. The air was thick with it, suffocating. And then, in the corner of their eye, Alex saw it. A figure. It wasn't clear at first, just a shadow in the corner of the room. But as Alex focused, the figure became clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch out of the darkness. It didn't have a face, no eyes or features, just a dark silhouette standing motionless. The shadow stood at the farthest corner of the basement, watching. And in that moment, Alex understood. It wasn't the figure in the corner that was the true threat. It was the basement itself, the house, the way everything seemed to be drawn to this one point in the dark. Alex's heart pounded in their chest. They could feel their legs shaking, but they couldn't move. The shadow didn't advance. It just watched, its form flickering like smoke in the darkness. The whisper came again, clearer than ever. "Help me, please." It was pleading. It was desperate. But Alex wasn't sure who or what was asking. The voice was familiar, but they couldn't place it. It didn't sound human, but it also didn't sound like the shadow. It felt like the house itself was speaking, the walls, the darkness. Alex turned their head. In the farthest corner of the basement, where the shadows seemed to move like liquid, they saw someone crouched in the dark. Person. A woman, pale and thin, her hair long and matted to her face. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with terror. She was staring at Alex, her mouth moving in silent words, but no sound came out. Alex's throat tightened. They didn't know who she was or how she got there, but one thing was clear. She was trapped, and something in this house had done this to her. The woman's mouth moved again, her eyes never leaving Alex. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Then, everything shifted. The shadow in the corner moved, taking a step forward, its form distorting like smoke. The room seemed to breathe with it, the walls stretching and shrinking as the shadow grew larger, taller. Alex stumbled back, heart racing. The woman in the corner looked up, her face twisted in pain. "Leave now," she whispered hoarsely, her voice ragged. But it was too late. The basement door slammed shut behind Alex. They were trapped. Alex's breath hitched as the basement door slammed shut behind them. The darkness grew heavier, pressing in from all sides. The woman in the corner was still watching them, her wide, unblinking eyes never leaving their face. The shadows seemed to move with her, twisting and curling like they were alive. Every inch of the room felt like it was closing in. Alex tried to move, but their legs felt like lead. The cold was unbearable now, a biting chill that dug into their skin, making every movement feel like a struggle. They couldn't understand what was happening. The whisper, the shadow, the woman, none of it made sense. But one thing was certain. They were no longer in control. The house, the darkness, had them now. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice trembling, her face filled with fear. "You have to leave. It's too late for me. But you can still escape." Alex's eyes darted between the woman and the shadow. The tall figure hadn't moved, but its presence was overwhelming. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was waiting, watching, like it was feeding off their fear. Who are you?" Alex whispered, their voice shaky. They wanted to understand, to make sense of everything. But the more they tried, the less clear it became. The woman's lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I was like you. I moved into this house. I thought I could escape. But it's not just the shadow. It's the house. Traps you. Feeds on you." Alex's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Traps you?" The woman's eyes flickered to the shadows, her expression turning darker. "It's not just the shadow. It's everything in this house. The walls, the floors, the air. It feeds off your fear. It makes you see things, hear things. Takes your mind, your soul. And when it's done with you," her voice trailed off, but the look in her eyes said everything. She wasn't just talking about herself. She was warning Alex, warning them about the thing that had taken her, the thing that was now after them. Suddenly, the room grew colder. Alex felt a shiver run down their spine as the shadows stretched and twisted. The lamp they had been holding flickered, its light dimming and then flickering back to life. But even that light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness that pressed in from every corner of the basement. "Don't let it touch you," the woman warned. "If it does, you'll never escape." Alex didn't understand. What was the shadow? What was happening to them? They looked at the basement door, hoping for a way out, but the door was gone. There was no handle, no crack of light, just an endless wall of blackness. They turned back to the woman. "How do I get out?" She shook her head. "You can't. No one ever does." A wave of panic surged through Alex. They backed away from the woman, the shadows closing in. Their breath quickened, and their heart raced. They could feel the air around them growing thick, heavy. The whisper, that same voice, echoed in their ears again. "Come closer." Alex's eyes shot to the shadow. It was moving now, slowly at first, but then it seemed to rush toward them, its form expanding, its limbs stretching out like claws. The air around Alex felt charged, filled with an energy that made their skin crawl. "Run," the woman cried, but Alex didn't need to be told. Every instinct in their body screamed at them to run, to get away from the thing that was coming for them. They spun around, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The basement was endless, the walls and shadows closing in around them. And then it happened. A hand, cold and heavy, gripped Alex's arm. They screamed, but no sound came out. The grip was like iron, cold and unrelenting. Alex tried to pull away, but the hand held them tighter, pulling them toward the darkness. "Please," Alex screamed, their voice finally breaking through the silence. But the shadows didn't care. They kept pulling, dragging them deeper into the basement, toward the thing that had been waiting. The woman's face twisted in terror as she reached out to Alex, but it was too late. She was already fading, her form dissolving into the shadows. "Run," she whispered one last time, but her voice was lost in the darkness. Alex's feet stumbled as they were dragged deeper, their body fighting against the force that pulled them, but it was useless. The cold was unbearable now, a biting frost that numbed their limbs. They couldn't feel their fingers anymore. Their mind was slipping. The shadows seemed to devour everything around them, until all they could see was the dark figure, the shadow. And then, just as Alex thought they couldn't take it anymore, everything stopped. The darkness froze, the air cleared, and Alex was standing still, alone. There was no basement, no shadow, no woman, just the eerie silence. The same silence that had filled the house since they first stepped inside. Alex's heart pounded in their chest. They looked around, disoriented. What had happened? Had it all been a dream? Had they imagined the whole thing? But then they saw it. In the corner of the room, in the farthest shadows, the shadow figure was still standing, watching. And it was closer. Alex stood still, frozen in place, staring at the corner of the room where the shadow had been. It was closer now, much closer. The darkness around it seemed to breathe, pulsing with a life of its own, and Alex could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on them. The air was thick, suffocating, and each breath felt like an effort. Alex's heart raced, their chest tightening with fear, but they couldn't move. The shadow was watching, and it was no longer just an outline in the corner. It had shape now, human-like yet distorted, as if it were something that didn't belong in this world. "No, no," Alex whispered, their voice barely a sound in the oppressive silence. The whispering voice from before returned, soft and sinister, drifting into Alex's ears like a breeze. "You can't escape." It wasn't the first time Alex had heard that voice, but it was the first time it felt so close, as if the shadow itself was speaking directly into their mind. The coldness in the room deepened, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. Alex wanted to run, to get away, but their legs wouldn't move. It was as if the shadow had wrapped its cold fingers around them, locking them in place. They could feel it now. The shadow was inside their mind. Its whispers were louder, filling their thoughts, drowning out everything else. "You're already mine." The voice hissed. "You've always been mine." Alex's eyes widened. "No," they whispered, shaking their head, trying to break free from the grip of fear that tightened around their chest. "I won't let you take me." But the shadow didn't answer. It just moved closer, its figure stretching and distorting as if it was becoming more solid with every step it took toward Alex. The air grew colder, and the darkness grew deeper. The room, once filled with light and the promise of escape, now felt like a suffocating void. Alex's mind was racing. There had to be something they could do. They couldn't just let this thing win. But what? The woman's warning echoed in their mind. "If it touches you, you'll never escape." And then it happened. A cold, icy hand touched Alex's shoulder. They gasped, the air leaving their lungs in a rush as the cold seeped into their skin, deeper than anything they had ever felt. It was like being submerged in ice water, freezing them from the inside out. "It's too late," the voice whispered, now closer than ever, filling their ears with its sinister tones. "You're already part of me." The world around Alex began to blur. The shadow was consuming them, and they couldn't escape. Their vision dimmed, and the basement seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in on them. Alex tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the shadows had stolen their voice, just like they had stolen everything else. "No, please." Alex tried again, but it was no use. The shadow's grip tightened, pulling them deeper into the dark, into the place where reality and nightmare collided. For a moment, Alex saw the woman again. Her face, pale and wide-eyed, appeared in front of them. But this time, she wasn't warning them. She was silent, her expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. She had already fallen into the shadow, and now Alex was next. "You can't fight me," the voice said, mocking them. "I've always been here, waiting, watching, and now you belong to me." The basement seemed to disappear, and in its place, a vast, endless darkness stretched out before Alex. It wasn't just the room anymore. The entire house was gone. The world had vanished, leaving only the suffocating blackness, the shadow, and the cold that gnawed at Alex's soul. The voice grew louder, its whispers becoming a roar in Alex's ears. "I will never let you go. You will be mine forever." But then, something unexpected happened. A faint light flickered in the distance, a small, trembling spark in the overwhelming darkness. Alex's mind, clouded by fear, latched onto it. A chance, a way out. With every ounce of strength they had left, Alex fought the cold, fought the shadow that was dragging them deeper into the abyss. They focused on the light, on the hope that it offered. They had to reach it. They couldn't let this thing win. Slowly, painfully, Alex moved. Their body felt like it was made of stone, each step heavier than the last, but they kept going. The whispers from the shadow grew louder, angrier, but Alex didn't listen. They couldn't. The light grew brighter the closer they got, its warmth pushing back the cold that had consumed them. Alex's fingers trembled as they reached for it, their heart pounding in their chest, but the darkness fought back, pulling at them with all its might. Just when Alex thought they couldn't go any further, they touched the light, and everything stopped. The cold, the darkness, the shadow, all of it ceased. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Alex opened their eyes, their body trembling with exhaustion. The basement was gone. The house was gone. They were back in their own room, lying in their bed, gasping for breath. The world outside was quiet. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting soft shadows on the floor. Everything was still, but Alex knew something was wrong. They could still feel the shadow. It lingered at the edge of their mind, like a dark cloud waiting to strike. It wasn't gone. It was still there, and it would never let go.